Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Melissa, and I'm about to start a new project. So I've seen a lot of videos of people taking paperback books and turning them into hardcover, which is something I want to try, and fortunately I have the perfect series for that, which is the Chronicles of Narnia. My Narnia books are well used and a little worse for wear, which makes them the perfect books for this project. Now, the first step was removing the covers from the text block, and this sounded really simple, but in reality it wasn't. When I was trying to do it, I kept almost slicing into like the first pages of the book. Once the cover was removed from the text block, I applied glue onto any of the pages that I had nicked during that process. And while that dried, I started on the next step, which was preparing the end pages. So end pages are sheets of paper that are folded in half and glued to the edge of the text block and then to the book cover. It's basically what holds the two together. To prepare these, I start by measuring the front of the text block, both the height and width. I then cut paper to the same height and double the width, and then score and fold it in half, and repeat for a total of 7 for the front of each book. Now, for the back, I did something different. I had decided that I wanted to keep the summary from the back cover, and the only place I could think to put it was on the back end page. So to do that, I had to get on the computer and retype all of the back covers. So I have this all in here, and I figured I'd just jump on real quick and show you kind of what I did. So the first thing I did was change my layout. So that's over here. Basically, I need it to be in landscape, which means that the paper is going wider instead of taller. I then changed the number of columns, which is this here. So I put it into 2 columns. And then in the settings, I set the width of the columns to like how wide I wanted the letters to go, or the words to go. And I just based that off of my book, basically just kind of measured the width of the text. Then I typed everything out, obviously, and set it so that it is all of the words are centered. And I think I also did shrink the margins, like over on the side of the paper, to 1/2 inch. And then to make sure that I definitely know that this is going to fit on the back of the book, I looked up here at this ruler and see these are the inch marks, and I zoomed in to the page down here, and I just held up a regular ruler until these inch marks matched up my real life ruler. So now I know that what I'm looking at is roughly how it will print, like the size it'll print and everything. And I can just take my cover and hold it up to the screen to see if it's the right size. After I had the pages set up, I printed them off and trimmed and folded them the same way I did for the front end pages. So to attach these to the text block, I applied a 1/4 inch of glue along the spine of my text block, using cardstock as kind of a mask to keep from adding the glue too far. I then laid on the end page and pressed it down, flipped the book over, and repeated for the back, obviously making sure on the back that I had the correct summary for the correct book and that everything was right sides up. After the end papers were all glued on, I just stacked them up and set something heavy on top of them to keep them pressed together while they dried. And then I moved on to the next step, which was cutting out the book covers. Now, apparently you can buy something called bookboard. However, I opted to just recycle some cardboard that I had. It's thicker than a cereal box, but thinner and more solid than cardboard. I'm not actually sure what it is. I get mine out of a subscription craft kit, and it seems to work pretty well. So I cut out 14 boards to the size of my book, so the height and width, and that's two for each book, obviously the front and back covers. Then I cut the spine to the same height, and I just used the text block to mark out the width. And I did label each of the spines as I went. I wasn't following a particular tutorial when I was doing this. I was kind of just going based off of memory, and there are a few things to note because of that. So the first is that the front edge of the cover is always naturally going to hang over the text block a little. And to match that, I should have actually cut my cover pieces a little taller than the text block. So then that would have had an overhang at the top and bottom. Honestly, I knew about that and just kind of didn't want to bother with it. But after I got my cover pieces cut out, I started having doubts. So that's when I went and looked up actually what I was supposed to be doing and discovered something interesting about the width of the spine. I looked at a few different tutorials and kept getting different answers as to what that width was supposed to be. There was one that said that the width was supposed to be wider than the text block and actually include the thickness of the front and back covers. And then there was one that actually said that the spine was supposed to be narrower than the text block. So really, I don't know. You'll notice that what I did was not an option that came up, at least not that I saw. However, it was already cut out and I wasn't changing it, so I just moved on ahead. Next, I had to decide on the space left in between each of the cover pieces, because you don't just glue all the pieces, like the front and back cover, touching the spine, because it wouldn't open that way. So you have to leave a gap between each piece. Based on what I had looked up online, 3/8 of an inch seemed to be what was most recommended. So to test that, I just laid out the pieces and taped them together with masking tape to try it out on the book. But to me, that seemed like it was maybe a little too big, because these books are pretty small and thin. So I ended up moving it down to 1/4 inch. While I had the boards taped, I went ahead and measured the width of the entire piece, because I was going to need that measurement for cutting out the fabric to cover it. Speaking of covering the boards, that is the next step. Now, a lot of the videos that I've seen, leather seems to be a popular choice. However, that is outside of my experience, so I opted for gray cotton quilting fabric instead. To cut this out, the fabric needs to be a rectangle that has a 1-inch overhang on all 4 sides. So I started by cutting the full width of the fabric to the needed height, because all of the books are obviously the same height. And then I took that strip of fabric and cut it to the needed widths for each book, making sure to cut off the selvage edges. Now, this fabric is not book cloth, which is specifically meant for bookbinding, and from my understanding is stiffer, more durable, and less likely to have glue seep through the fabric when attaching it to the cover. Now, there is a method to turn any kind of fabric into book cloth using a product called Heat and Bond, but I didn't feel like messing with that, so I just used an alternate method, which is applying stick glue to the back of the fabric, which once dried is supposed to stiffen the fabric and create a barrier between the liquid glue and the fabric. Time to attach the fabric to the boards. I used 2 quilting rulers to make sure that I was placing the boards both straight and at the proper distance from the edges of the fabric. I just used a foam brush to apply the glue to the board in a very thin layer, and then placed it on the fabric, and a strip of cardboard cut to 1/4 inch as a spacer to make sure that I was spacing the spine the proper distance from the front and back covers. And I made sure to glue the spines with the title facing up so that I knew which book cover I was working on. After I had both covers and the spine glued down, I trimmed the edges down to 1 inch. A step that I pretty much forgot on every cover other than the ones that I filmed. I then trimmed those corners at a 45-degree angle, leaving a slight overhang, so it's not like right up against the corner of the cover, but a little away from it, 45-degree angle. And then glue these tabs down, starting with the top and bottom tabs and finishing with the side tabs. But that's 1 down and 6 more to go. So while I do that, let's talk about glue. I'm using Aleene's Tacky Glue for this. It is, according to Google at least, a PVA glue, which is the type of glue that you're supposed to use for bookbinding. You're also supposed to use a non-acid glue, and I'm not sure that this particular glue is, because the brand actually sells a glue that's specifically labeled as non-acid. So I assume that means that the regular glue is not. And from my understanding, the concern the acid and the glue will yellow the pages and cause damage to them over time. However, I'm not looking for these to last 50 years or however long, so I'm not really that worried about it. And if you were wondering, the glue stick did seem to work to prevent the liquid glue from seeping through the fabric to be seen on the outside of the covers, because I didn't see any spots once the covers were dry. And now for the fun part, which is of course decorating the books. Most videos I've seen use a Cricut, and I think it's like iron-on vinyl or something for this step, but I don't have a Cricut, and so I decided to paint my covers. I want these to look pretty cohesive but still kind of a little individual, so I decided to use the same layout but a different paint color per book. So the layout I settled on was the title at the top, with a silhouette underneath that would relate to each individual book, and then some dry brushing around the corners and edges of the front cover. I used the original covers of these books for a lot of my inspiration as I decided what to do for each book. Starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I chose blue for this because there's a lot of blue in the cover, and obviously a big part of the story is the White Witch's spell, which causes it to be always winter and never Christmas. As for the silhouette, the first thing I really think of is the image of Lucy entering the wardrobe, but that is from the movie and really doesn't make a very good silhouette. So instead, I flipped through the book and found an illustration of the lamppost, which I then took a picture of and resized it on the computer, then printed it out on cardstock. I then cut the silhouette out of the cardstock and placed it onto the front of the book. I also had printed out the format for how I wanted the title to go on the top of the book, and I used that to kind of gauge my spacing so that I was putting the silhouette in the right spot. So I placed the silhouette down, used a paintbrush, and just carefully filled in that space. Then after I removed the mask, I went back in and added some of those smaller details as well as a few touch-ups. Then I painted the corners of the covers. I was trying to go for something of a dry brushing technique, but as I went along, I ended up pretty much just painting the corners of all of the covers, and then like a line connecting each corner along the edge of each cover as well. And this blue that I used is a little brighter than I would have liked. I would have liked more of a, I guess, snowy or icy blue. But I didn't have any blue that color, and I really didn't want to try and mix up a custom paint color because I'm not that good at that. So I just opted to use what I had. I associate purple with Prince Caspian, probably because, again, of the cover. However, the only purple paint I had was definitely the wrong shade, so I went with a magenta color instead. And for the silhouette, I couldn't think of anything more appropriate than Caspian using Susan's horn. Unfortunately, that is the picture that's on the original cover, so I actually used the cover and carefully cut out that image as well as the armhole cutouts. I then placed the cover back on top of my, well, the paper cover on top of my hardcover, positioning it where I wanted it, and then I temporarily glued those arm cutouts onto the cover with stick glue so that the area wouldn't get painted, and then carefully painted it in, along with painting, of course, the corners and the edges. Voyage of the Dawn Treader happens mostly at sea, so this teal paint was an easy choice for it. And again, I used the cover image for my silhouette, just like I did for the last one, pretty much with the exact same methods, and personally, I think that this cover actually turned out the best. Next is the silver chair, and it should seem pretty obvious what color and symbol I would use for this. However, gray or silver as a color doesn't work because my covers are already gray. So I chose black for that instead. And as for the chair, doing an ornate chair as a silhouette doesn't work very well. So what I ended up doing was cutting out the chair from the cover, but as I was cutting it out, I kind of modified it a little, made some of the shapes a little more simple. And instead of trying to use the original cover as a mask, I actually took the chair cutout, placed it onto the hardcover, traced it with a pencil, and then took a paint marker and used that to fill in the shape. I chose yellow paint for the horse and his boy. It was kind of a toss-up between yellow and orange, but I thought that the orange was going to be too bright. And then for the symbol, I just found a silhouette of a horse online, which I printed onto cardstock and cut out for my template. Unfortunately, the yellow paint did not cover very well, and I had to do, I think, 3 layers in order to get it really solid. And by that point in time, the cardstock kind of actually stuck to my cover a little and left little pieces on it when I took it off. So then I had to go back in and do some touch-ups, and this whole image just ended up looking a little messy to me. I had a hard time deciding what I was going to do for the Magician's Nephew. I knew I wanted green paint because, I mean, just look at the paperback cover. But I didn't know what symbol, because the only things that really stood out to me from that story were the rings that are used to transport them to and from Narnia in that story. And I just couldn't wrap my mind around how to achieve the look that I would want with that. So then I thought about it some more and finally settled on a tree. And this is another thing that's kind of hard to do a silhouette of. So instead, I kind of freehanded it following a tutorial that I found online. The Last Battle is the final book in the series, and I used a lion silhouette, which I once again found online and printed out of cardstock to make my template. And then I chose red for the paint. And actually, this particular shade of red up against the gray fabric, and of course being a lion silhouette, really reminded me of Peter's shield from the movies. I had planned to use this paint pen for writing the titles on the books. However, I found that I could not get fine enough lines for lettering, especially for writing on the spine. So I had to go look up other options and found that actually the marker that I use for drawing comes up as something that quilters sometimes use for handwriting labels or for signing quilts. So I opted to just use that instead. And after looking at my finished book covers, I decided not to bother with putting the title on the front cover, because especially for some of the longer titles, I just didn't feel like I was going to have the room to get it on there right. So instead, I chose only to do it on the spine. So I just wrote, starting at the top with C.S. Lewis, which obviously is the author, and then followed it with the book title. I left off any numbers because Narnia apparently has a bit of a debate similar to Star Wars on whether you read it chronologically or in publication order. Now, it was suggested that you heat set the marker after you wrote on the fabric. And I did that on one of my covers, but then I got really nervous about it because it seemed like the spine was loosening up or softening, and I wasn't sure if it was going to like negatively affect the glue. So I decided not to do that on any of the rest of them because I think a big part of heat setting it is like so that it won't run when it gets wet. And if these get wet, then I have a bigger problem than the ink running. Next, I sealed the front covers with a matte varnish. I almost skipped this step because in the past I've used varnishes and ended up with kind of a sticky mess. But when I used this particular brand before, I didn't have that problem. So I went ahead and took a chance, though I did make sure to do a very thin layer. And the final step is gluing the text block to the cover. This is the part that I was really having a hard time figuring out when I was watching videos and was kind of nervous about. So this is what I did, but I don't know if it's actually technically right. So I started by fitting the cover around the text block and making sure the spines were pressed together. I then took a pencil and marked where the edges of the pages landed on both the front and back covers. Then I opened up the cover, applied glue to it, and then laid down the end page on the glue, smoothing it out and making sure the edges of my paper lined up with the marks that I had made previously. I then stuck a plastic bag in between that front page and the rest of the text block before flipping everything over and repeating for the back page. And then I placed it back under a heavy object to dry. Then I just had to repeat it 6 more times. Okay, so they are all dried, and now it's time to see how I did as far as gluing these together. I am not too sure, really, because like I said, I went based on memory, which probably was not the best idea for creating the cover. But we're going to see how it opens. Okay, so it opens pretty good, first page and last page. What I'm kind of concerned about is whether or not it will open and lay well in the middle. So it seems like it does all right. I was really skeptical about how these would turn out when I was doing it because it just seemed like it wasn't going to turn out right. I guess part of that's because when you're trying to test the fit and it's not glued down, it shifts a lot more. But so far, I'm 2 books in and they seem to be all right. Alright, well, I have tested all of them and they all opened fine, and really especially at the end of the project that was my biggest concern. So I am very happy with how these turned out, especially for being new to doing this and having done it on kind of a budget. This is not going to be my last bookbinding project. I do have another one already planned that will be out probably in the next month or so. But as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.